In this 110th anniversary year of 1916, I've set out to ensure we remember not just Verdun and the Somme, but some of the lesser-known operations which took place that year too. The fighting at St Eloi in Flanders in the spring of 1916, involving British and Canadian troops, is one example of this. And approaching this differently, what we're going to do in this episode is talk about the battle in March and April 1916, and then hear the accounts of two Canadian soldiers serving there from the same battalion, taken from two fantastic and themselves lesser-known memoirs of the Great War. So where are we? The village of St Eloi feels little more than a hamlet today. You can walk or drive through it in minutes. It has no church. There are some houses, many of them from recent decades, and a few agricultural buildings. The pre-1914 village was a little different, but it took on an importance greater than its physical size because it sat at the junction of four roads, south of the city of Ypres and on some of the rising ground of the wider Messines Ridge. British and French troops had fought here during the First Battle of Ypres in October and November 1914, and then when the line stabilised in that first winter in this area, it became the left flank of the British Army on the Western Front. Then at St Eloi, its most northern position on a line only tens of miles long at that time, the bulk of the Western Front being held by the French Army at this stage. St Eloi was a good choice for a juncture in the line, because to the north was the city of Ypres itself, then held by the French, but one of the four roads in the village went towards the neighbouring village of Vormezele, a useful staging post for units in the line. Here in Vormezele were big houses that had cellars, covered approaches to St Eloi, and space to dig the infrastructure of the battlefield, from communication trenches to dugouts to mortar positions and field gun positions as well, and all of these weapons becoming increasingly important in the static nature of warfare on the Western Front at that time. But the small village of St Eloi itself was split between the British and the Germans, with the latter having the slight advantage of occupying that rising ground of the Messines Ridge, the high ground to the south of the city of Ypres. And one curious feature on the battlefield here was the mound, as it was noted on trench maps, quite literally that, an earth mound that gave additional observation to the Germans, of course, and was in their possession. What it was, the mound, and how it came to be there isn't at all clear, and it showed on a flat landscape that even a small rise like that could give someone an advantage. In 1915, localised operations saw trench lines get closer and closer at St Eloi, and the war here replicated the wider conflict at that time and started to go underground with the use of men from the newly formed tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers. Now, this war beneath the battlefield, the war underground, was relatively new. It had started in that first winter of the war in 1914-15, when the French had carried out underground operations, the Germans the same. The British began to do tentative mining operations with divisional mining companies, and then this was formalised eventually in 1915 into these tunnelling companies that were part of the Royal Engineers, the Corps of Royal Engineers. And these men who were brought from civilian mining occupations or were miners who were already serving in the army and transferred into these tunnelling companies took the war beneath the surface to dig tunnels, to lay massive charges of explosive underneath enemy positions and literally blow them to pieces. And both sides were doing that, and often this kind of warfare met beneath a battlefield like St Eloi, with the Germans tunnelling and blowing mines and the British doing the same. And this type of underground operation at St Eloi had resulted in more than 30 craters being formed on the surface by explosions on this part of the battlefield. It was literally pockmarked with the evidence of that war beneath the battlefield. While the post-Second Ypres to pre-Messines Third Ypres period, which is May 1915 through to May 1917, is often considered quiet because it's sandwiched between two great battles. Second Ypres with the German advance and the first use of poison gas, and Messines and Third Ypres with the use of tunnellers on a much bigger scale, and the subsequent advance at Third Ypres towards Passchendaele to try and break out of that stranglehold of the Germans occupying the high ground in that area. That bit in between those two great offensives is often considered a quiet period. But the reality, not just in Flanders, but on the length of the Western Front in many ways, was that many minor operations would take place in sectors like this, despite the fact there were no big battles going on, let alone the day-to-day activities of trench warfare just holding the line. Now, at St Eloi in 1916, one of these localised minor operations was planned by the Second Army headquarters. This was the army responsible for the Ypres salient, commanded by General Plumer, and would remain responsible for the wider Ypres area for most of the Great War. They planned an operation to take place in the St Eloi sector for March 1916, and this was partially in response to the German attack a few weeks previously on the bluff further north, when they'd assaulted between Verbranden-Molen, the main area of the bluff, and the Ypres-Commune Canal, and Second Army headquarters wanted to fight back at the Germans. They weren't just going to take an attack like that, and this turned into a kind of typical example, really, of the tit-for-tat warfare on this part of the Western Front, typical of attritional warfare at this stage of the conflict. And the plan for the attack on St Eloi was that 172 Tunnelling Company Royal Engineers, so some of these men who worked beneath the battlefield, would blow 6 mines from west to east across the German lines, allowing 2 assaulting infantry battalions from the 3rd Division, 1st Northumberland Fusiliers and the 4th Royal Fusiliers, both regular army units, although, of course, by this stage of the war, there's not that many regulars left, and the ranks are now filled with new army men who'd volunteered in the early stage of the war. Their job was to attack across the mines, capture the German positions, and move on and meet up in the German third line at St Eloi. This attack, it was hoped, would deliver a body blow to the Germans and bite off a kind of salient within a salient in this area of the Ypres battlefield. So the wider salient, the curve that went around Ypres at that time, within it were these mini salients, and at St Eloi the Germans had this incursion into the British lines, giving them a kind of advantage. At 4:15 a.m. on the 27th of March 1916, the 6 mines were successfully detonated by 172 Tunnelling Company. The infantry went into action just 30 seconds later to minimise the gap between the explosion of the mines and the advance of the main attack, and the combined artillery, supplemented by the guns of the Canadian Corps, who were also in this sector, crashed down on the German trenches. The 1st Northumberland Fusiliers on the right got across no man's land into the German lines with very few losses, but while the mound, that mound of earth, had been destroyed, many Germans had survived in the 4th Royal Fusilier sector on the left. The number 5 crater, which had been blown, had quickly been occupied by the Germans, and the Fusiliers came under heavy machine gun fire. Visibility was bad on the battlefield. Some men got lost and got confused in that fighting. German artillery fire joined the machine guns and fell on every part of the battlefield, causing losses amongst the assault battalions. The reserves from the 1st Royal Scots Fusiliers came up to help consolidate, and while the ground was taken and held, it was at the cost of 40 officers and 810 men killed, wounded and missing in these 3 battalions involved in the vanguard of the battle. The casualties meant that the work of the stretcher bearers was incredibly important once more, recovering those hit and still alive from this muddy crater zone around St Eloi, and assisting them in the 4th Royal Fusiliers sector was their chaplain, the Reverend Noel Mellish. Noel Mellish was born at Barnet in 1880. He'd served in Baden-Powell's police as a trooper in the Boer War, so had seen war before. Originally, he'd been a chaplain at the base, then joined a field ambulance, and was posted as chaplain to the 4th Royal Fusiliers in late 1915. So by the time of the Battle of St Eloi in the spring of 1916, he was well versed with the battalion, the men within that battalion, and they knew him. At St Eloi, he was out on the battlefield constantly, working with the battalion stretcher bearers in the area around the German trenches and the mine craters, bringing in the wounded, tending to their needs, both physical and spiritual, in terms of helping the stretcher bearers dress wounds and getting those men away. And he continued to do this over several days, making journey after journey onto that battlefield and saving many soldiers, many Fusiliers' lives in the process, for which he was awarded a Victoria Cross, one of several chaplains in the Great War to receive that distinction. Mellish served throughout the conflict. He later got the Military Cross as well, and in the Second World War he was an ARP warden. And the crater, very close to where he was awarded his Victoria Cross, the action that resulted in the VC, is still there today, although unfortunately it's now behind a private gate and you can't see it as well as you once could. As the dust settled on this initial phase of the fighting at St Eloi, the units who had been in this action had fought, they discovered, soldiers from the Reserve Jäger Battalion number 18 of the German army, and had taken over 200 of them prisoner, and along with them found lots of battlefield booty, as official photographs from the action show. Now, this was a turning point in the conflict in a number of different ways, because this was one of the first actions in which official photographers took images for a wider use. The value of images as propaganda had been realised by 1916. The War Office was gradually kind of catching up to this, really. So they appointed a number of official photographers and cinematographers. Geoffrey Malins, who became famous for the Somme film a few months later, was here at St Eloi filming aspects of this battle from a distance. And the images taken after the action around those craters, showing in particular men from the Northumberland Fusiliers, show men with prisoners, show men with the booty they'd picked up off the battlefield, from bayonets to a Stahlhelm, which was quite unusual at that stage of the war. Many of the British soldiers probably had never seen one of those at this stage. German gas masks, bits of signalling equipment, and because they'd been facing a Jäger regiment, they wore shakos instead of Pickelhaubers, the spiked helmets, and they captured quite a few of those as well, with the regimental badge on the front. And again, we see this in the propaganda images that came out of this, and they were turned into postcards, and some of the very earliest use of official photographs as propaganda postcards date from this battle here at St Eloi. But this wasn't an end to a battle. These units had come out the line, captured their objectives, walked away with their souvenirs, but this was not the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. As the British pulled out of the newly won positions at St Eloi on the 3rd of April 1916, the men of the Canadian Corps moved in. The weather had got worse, and many of the trenches and mine craters were now flooded, and the battlefield was a muddy quagmire. But this was a significant moment in the history of the Canadian Corps, which had only existed a few months by the time of this battle, and still had its original commander, Lieutenant General Sir Edwin Alderson, a British officer who'd served alongside the Canadians in the Boer War and had a great respect for them, and the Canadians, I think, had a great respect for him too. The Corps now had 3 Canadian divisions, the newly arrived 3rd Canadian Division to join the 1st and the 2nd, and it was now holding the line further down the Messines Ridge sector as the 3rd Canadian Division became accustomed to conditions on the front line. These Canadians had held the line within the Corps, served in the trenches. Some had fought at Second Ypres or Festubert, but those men were in the minority, really, because the casualties there had been heavy. Some of those had been wounded and returned. Others, of course, were dead on the battlefield, prisoners of war, or so seriously injured that they hadn't come back. So probably the majority of men serving in the Canadian Corps at this time had not seen a major engagement. So This was essentially their first time in action, that first major battle for the Canadians as a corps on the Western Front. However, the trenches at St Eloi were far from ideal. In fact, they were a nightmare, smashed up by artillery, waterlogged and difficult to hold. Canadians from units of the 2nd Canadian Division found themselves in an unenviable position, and before they had a chance to react to conditions on the ground, the Germans attacked. On the night of the 5th-6th April 1916, the Germans opened a terrific bombardment that lasted until 2 a.m. It paused and then restarted once more Canadians had moved up to assist, and this time they were hit by everything from trench mortars, Minenwerfers, through to heavy guns. At 3:30 a.m. on the 6th of April 1916, the German infantry attacked and took Craters 2, 3 and 4 in the central part of the battlefield. These were only defended by a handful of men from the 28th Canadian Battalion, who didn't really stand a chance against the German onslaught. Heavy fighting on the flanks led to the loss of Crater number 5, but Crater number 6 was held by the 31st Battalion from Alberta. And that's where these two accounts of the fighting that we're going to quote crisscross over this part of the landscape of the Great War. And the first of these two accounts is the Journal of Private Fraser, first published in 1985, and a book I came across because I met a Canadian Great War veteran. In fact, he was born in Kent and emigrated with his brothers to Canada before the war. They'd joined up in one of the Canadian infantry battalions, and he'd then been transferred to the 21st Battalion on the Western Front and had fought at Courcelette in the first attack on the village and the attack on Sugar Trench, and after that, for a number of different reasons, which I have spoken about on the podcast before, including the fact that he was underage, he was sent back to the Canadian depot in the UK, where he remained for the rest of the war. Now, when I met him and went to see him, he showed me this book, The Journal of Private Fraser. It wasn't one that I was familiar with. Fraser served in the 31st Battalion, not his 21st, but they had very similar wars, being in the same Canadian division. And Lance Cattermole spoke very, very highly of this book. So I managed to find a bookseller in the States who had a copy, ordered it. It was much more complex in those days before the internet, and it came over. And it is an absolutely magnificent Great War memoir, one of my favourites, no doubt. Donald Fraser was an interesting character. He was born in Edinburgh in 1882, and his father was a dealer in spirits, and the young Fraser had grown up in a fairly middle-class family. After the death of his father, he emigrated to Canada in 1906, worked first as a labourer, then in a bank in Manitoba, and then moved to Vancouver, where he worked for the Royal Trust Company until he enlisted in the 31st Battalion on its formation at Calgary in 1914. He served for 3 years on the front line, constantly, with the 31st Battalion and also the Canadian Machine Gun Corps. Survived the war, of course, and expanded his journal based on diaries he'd made during the war, and wrote this fairly coherent account from beginning to end. Sadly, Fraser died in 1946, so he never saw the work published in his lifetime, but it remains one of the best ordinary soldier accounts of the Great War in my mind, and stands side by side with Will Bird's And We Go On, perhaps better known to you as Ghosts Have Warm Hands, making it one of the defining Canadian memoirs of conflict in the whole of the 20th century. This, then, is Fraser's account of St Eloi. During our occupation of the crater, the enemy bombarded our new positions with fire of various degrees of intensity, paying especial attention to the stretch from Bathurst Butts to beyond Campbelltown Corner. There was practically no cover when we took over this portion, owing to the severe shelling it had undergone. The line was held by very few men, a few groups of gunners and bombers and roving sentries, and it scarcely afforded shelter even for these few. This gap, so sparsely and insecurely held by the left and right flanks of the 27th and 31st Battalions respectively, faded away under the devastating fire of the enemy. The men were either buried by the deluge of shells or blown out by the explosions, and the remnants recoiled to the flanks to escape complete annihilation. The ground was churned beyond recognition, and no living thing could stay upon it. About 3 a.m. on the 6th, before the 27th were properly relieved, the enemy sent over a hurricane bombardment which destroyed almost every vestige of the line from Sackville Centre to the extreme left, and within it perished the remaining sentries, for when the enemy advanced in parties down the Witcharter Road, scarcely a rifle shot was to be heard. About 250 of the enemy penetrated into craters number 2 and 3, and by night they were in possession of craters 4 and 5. The latter were those the 31st were to occupy, when all the time they were hanging on to 2 old craters 6 and 7. The existence of the larger craters they were unaware of. It was owing to this confusion that the enemy were able to get the footing they did, and it was only on the 16th of April, when the sky cleared, that our airmen were able to detect this disastrous error. During this time, the Germans in craters 4 and 5 were left in absolute peace by our artillery, and consequently were able to concentrate their efforts on further aggression. About 4:30 a.m. on the 6th of April, after the attack on the 27th Battalion, a large body of the enemy, about 150, was seen advancing towards our line in the direction of crater number 6. Rifle fire was brought to bear on them, and many were killed and wounded, whilst the remainder fled or took refuge in shell holes. Towards the evening, a batch of about 20 or so advanced in single file, each man with his hands on his neighbour's shoulders. Fire was opened on them, and only a few regained their lines. There is some division of opinion as to whether they intended to attack or surrender. Some believe they were bombers, for they noticed bombing aprons on them. At dawn the next morning, a small party, presumably the survivors, came over opposite D Company. Firing at them, 7 were killed, 1 wounded, and 4, including the wounded man, were taken prisoner. They intended surrendering, for it was found they had no arms. They declared our artillery fire was terrific, and they had at least 2,000 casualties. One remarked that 7 of the 27th men were taken captive, having mistaken their way. Counter-attacks were organised by the bombers of each battalion in the brigade, and they were futile, the bombers being either cut to pieces, lost their way, or through sheer exhaustion were unable to push forward through the mud. A number of those on the left managed to force their way to craters 6 and 7, and found the 31st in possession, so retired as there appeared to be confusion as to what further was to be done. They only repeated the former mistake by occupying the wrong craters. A call from the Major Daly, to A Company for bombers and Corporal Hunter with a small party, they proceeded to the fray. The corporal on the way showed those who were uncertain about the handling of the Mills bomb how the deed was done. It was quite a picture, these few moments, an exhibition of how to grasp the bomb above the lever, pull the pin, then the throw. Some of them reached the crater where D Company was, but on account of some reason or other they were not required, so retired, picking their way across the open in the face of much danger. On the night of the 8th, the 19th Battalion of the 4th Brigade relieved our sorely tried battalion. Our company trudged its way out to rest billets by the Lille-Ypres road, very weary and sad at heart for the loss of so many gallant fellows. The battalion casualties were about 180. Out of this, A Company had 5 killed, 45 wounded, 2 suffering from shock and 1 missing. D Company, who occupied the crater last, was struck the hardest. The 27th Battalion, who bore the brunt of the fighting, had a casualty roll of 217, whilst the 29th had 117 and the 28th 101. Fraser describes how they came out of the line and went into rest, and 10 days later the events at St Eloi were still very much on their mind. And he notes in his journal, a brother of Rowley, who was killed at St Eloi, was here making inquiries. He was quite a youngster and belonged to an English battalion. He appeared down in the mouth over his errand. And of course Fraser and his comrades had no good news for that brother, because Rowley, Frank Elson Rowley, had been killed on the battlefield at St Eloi. Rowley was an original 31st Battalion man, like Fraser, and from Willenhall in Staffordshire. His brother had served with the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, and unbeknown to them, the two brothers had been within a few feet of each other in the trenches at St Eloi. Frank Rowley's name is listed on the 31st Battalion panel on the Menin Gate, and back in the 1980s, after I'd acquired Fraser's book, I found his medals in a junk shop and still have them today. One of those strange Great War coincidences that never are coincidences, of course. Thankfully, Rowley's brother survived the war, and I wonder if he and Frank's widow attended the unveiling of the Willenhall War Memorial, which lists Frank's name. The second account comes from a more recently acquired memoir, recently acquired by me, a book called Medicine and Duty, the published memoirs of a medical officer of the 31st Battalion, Captain Harold McGill. Another curious connection is that McGill was the medical officer who inspected Frank Rowley on his enlistment in the 31st Battalion, and his name and signature is on Rowley's attestation papers. Harold McGill was from an Irish-Canadian family. He'd lost his parents to typhoid and had later studied medicine both in Canada and also in America. When war broke out in 1914, McGill was 34 and running a medical practice in Calgary. After joining up, he became the 31st Battalion's original medical officer and served with them on the front line until the fighting at Lens, so for well over 2 years. After the war, he returned to being a doctor, but the experiences in the war were always in the back of his mind, and he wrote an account that he'd hoped to have published, which was nearly published in the mid-1930s, but the publishing company went bankrupt, and the account remained unpublished until 2007. So while this book came out nearly 20 years ago now, it was one that I've never come across before. I saw a mention of it in a social media post, tracked down a copy on eBay. It's not an expensive book, it's not a rare book, but it's certainly a book that I would recommend. And what we're going to have now is his account of the Battle of St Eloi in April 1916 from the perspective of the 31st Battalion's regimental medical officer. At 1 a.m. on April the 5th, I returned to Spoilbank and found that a collection of walking wounded had gathered there during my absence. These we cleared to Bedford House. The artillery duel maintained its full intensity throughout the night. Walking wounded continued to pass through our hands all day, but those unable to walk were forced to remain in the trenches until after dark. Many casualties were being reported from the front line. At 7 p.m, Willis and I made another visit to Vormezela and went up Convent Lane as far as the bombers' dugout in Shell Alley. A stretcher squad was going up the firing line to bring out Sergeant Wilson of A Company, who was reported badly wounded. The shelling had almost ceased. At 9 p.m. we returned to Vormezela, and 2 hours later Sergeant Wilson was brought in. He afterwards died of his wounds. By this time the enemy was busily engaged in shelling on our right again. It was midnight when we returned to Spoilbank. By 2 a.m. on the 6th of April, we had all of our wounded cleared from the Spoilbank aid post, and I lay down in an attempt to get a little sleep. I was aroused at 3:30, and the following extract from my diary explains why. A most terrific and concentrated bombardment is taking place on our position in front of and about St Eloi. Enemy using trench torpedoes and artillery shells of all kinds and sizes. Hundreds of shells must be bursting per minute. We must expect heavy casualties, especially by way of Vormezela. I do not know that I can add much to what I wrote down at the time to describe the scene from the top of the hill at Spoilbank. I went out of the dugout and climbed the bank from whence I had a clear view of the devastating rain of shells bursting in our line less than a mile away. I was close enough to see the burning fuses of the trench mortar bombs as they described the sharp curves of their courses. The air seemed to be full of them. I shuddered to think of what our poor fellows of D Company were enduring under this hail of fire and steel. The uproar and turmoil of battle lasted throughout the day. Wounded coming in told of an infantry attack being repulsed from our battalion front, but some were of the opinion that the Germans had obtained a foothold in the craters to our right. All morning and afternoon we worked in the regimental aid post dugout, dressing and sending out wounded, chiefly walking cases. A stretcher bearer of A Company called Avery came in with shell wounds of the back. He had dressed wounded for 48 hours under shell fire and carried on for some time after being hit himself. Cases of shattered nerves appeared in the stream of wounded, but only some half-dozen in all. I sent the worst of these out to the 5th Field Ambulance at Bedford House, but the majority I allowed to lie down in an adjoining dugout. I also detained a few men who had been buried by shells, as I counted upon making use of them later. By 6 p.m. the bombardment had died down. Many dead and wounded were reported from the front lines. 70 bearers from the 6th Field Ambulance prepared to clear the right sector of wounded by way of Wormsele after dark. Several badly wounded were reported from C Company, which was holding the centre of our battalion front, and from which an enemy infantry attack had been repulsed. Rain was now falling. At 8 p.m. I left for the front line with Major Hugel, taking with me Corporal Bright and a party of the men who'd been resting in the dugout. On our way we met a scout coming in to report at headquarters. He and his companion had been out all day scouting between the lines during the action. His mate had been killed by a Jack Johnson as they were making their way back to our lines after dark. We went up to where the front line had been. A battery of our 9.2s was playing on the German trenches in front of our position and planting shells within a short distance of our front line. The trenches occupied by C Company had been pretty well obliterated, but a few shallow dugouts remained intact, within which the wounded and those not on guard duty were sheltered from the rain which was coming down in sheets. Many of the off-duty unwounded, worn out as they were by the strain and exertion of the day, were sleeping soundly in spite of the crashing explosions and concussions of our heavy shells. There was considerable artillery activity the next morning, April the 7th, but the day seemed quiet and peaceful after the thunderous din of the preceding day. At 5 in the evening we had a furious bombardment of 1 hour upon our long-suffering right sector. What remained of our communication trench, Convent Lane, leading up to Wormsele, was smashed to pieces. As we set off, we received word that the 19th Battalion would relieve our unit after dark. The action in which we'd been engaged was beyond all comparison the most severe and important encounter in which our unit had taken part since coming to France. All ranks had behaved splendidly. Lieutenant Colonel Bell, commanding, said that he'd always supposed the battalion worthy of the utmost confidence, and that now he knew it. Our casualties consisted of 29 killed, 6 officers and 148 other ranks wounded, and 4 men missing, probably buried in the mud of the craters and the trenches by shell fire. So for both Fraser and McGill, there were many more battles ahead in their war, just as there was for Canada, and along with it, much more sacrifice too. But this battle here, 110 years ago at St Eloi, had significance. It was one of those footsteps where the men of the Canadian Corps moved into the light of a wider world and showed what Canada could do. St Eloi cost Canada nearly 1,400 casualties in just a few days' fighting, bloody days in a bloody war, but which for men like Donald Fraser and Harold McGill would become part of their defining experience along that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.